Right, well, good morning, church. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. Many times I sit upstairs and shine the light on everybody. Now I get to sit here and see just how bright those spotlights really are. But as Tim mentioned, we're in our fifth week of the series on Unstuck. The first several weeks we talked about things that internally get us stuck and prevent God's future promise from becoming real in our lives. Well, today I want to talk about the things that externally can really hold us back. The name of the message today is getting unstuck from the chaotic world around us. Does anybody feel like this world is a little bit of a mess right now? Yeah, right, good. I'm speaking to the right people here. At work, when I talk to a lot of people and they say, how's it going? Usually my typical response is, just trying to find my place in this crazy world. And that's what it feels like a lot of times. We live in a very broken and confusing world, and what we're going to discover today is just really what's our role in that as believers, and what are some things that we can do to kind of break out of that. So Faith is going to pull up the first slide here, which is, I made a list of kind of some of the things that we're all witnessing right now within the world. I broke up into kind of economic, kind of geopolitical and social buckets here, but looking on the left, this is not a complete list, by the way, obviously, but looking on the left, you can see a lot of things that all of us are impacted by on a daily basis, inflation, gas prices. Number 5, has anybody heard the term shrinkflation? Yeah, so for those that haven't, this is how companies are trying to keep their costs down by actually making the products smaller. So I was reading an article today about potato chips and how they're reduced in volume. I'm like, well, I kind of feel gypped by potato chip companies anyway, so I'm going to get like 2 potato chips in a bag now. But those are very economic, they're very real things that we have to experience in our life. The geopolitical side, long list there, number 2. Man, it's really hard to kind of watch any type of news or have any type of conversation without it getting into a lot of political bitterness and partisanship, and I just think that's really, really unhealthy for us as human beings and especially as believers. And then the social side, and that entire list just really makes my heart hurt, just to see that all the things that people are going through, especially the kids and teens in this world. And I think if you look at that complete list and just kind of digest kind of what that feels like when you consume a lot of that news, and if you sit in front of it quite a bit and you read about it in social media, it can get kind of heavy, and I think it can really distract you from exactly what we're supposed to be doing as believers. I know I stopped watching the news a long time ago, and I really scaled back a lot of my social media to the point to where every August I log out of everything and take a hiatus. And after about 2 weeks, I cannot explain just the peace that brings. So I'm really looking forward to logging out this time, and every year I get just a little bit closer to not going back to it. So hopefully this will be the year I don't do it. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about how this can prevent us really from fulfilling the final words that Jesus left us with before he returned to the Father, and that's the Great Commission in Matthew 28:19. So go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. During the early days of COVID, I swore at everybody's sick and tired of talking about COVID. I know I am too, but it's a good frame of reference for me to kind of talk about this. I remember those early days and weeks, and I remember just the internal tremors that I had, not knowing what was going on, and just how fearful that was, to the point where I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I was doing a bathroom remodel, and instead of making a mistake in one every 15 tiles, I was making a mistake in one every 3, because I just couldn't think, I couldn't analyze anything. And then as it moved along, it got into being felt very real and close. And my wife was furloughed at the company that I work at. Production had stopped. They started cutting pay. They started furloughing workers. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do if I lose my job, if I lose my house, if I lose all this? And looking back on it, I kind of realized something. And what I realized was that I was more concerned about my security and prosperity in this world than I was with the mission in the next. And that left a real powerful impact upon me. So what I want to kind of go through today is really kind of venture into, okay, now what? And so what I discovered as I went through this is I feel like, as I've studied and kind of went into this phase, that okay, what do I feel? Where do I feel like I am right now? And it led me to a place I did not really expect, and that is to the life of an exile. And so many of us have a traditional viewpoint of an exile being a disparate group of people that's been relocated from one place to another. We think of the Israelites being taken into Babylon, or even in modern day, the Ukrainians. There have been over 3 million people from Ukraine that have been displaced into the surrounding countries. But what I want to talk about here is a little bit about is taking this really beyond just this physical displacement of people, because it's a narrative that I think we see throughout the Scriptures, both in the Old and New Testament. So the first key takeaway I want to leave you with is this, is as followers of Jesus, we are exiles in this time and in this place. And I understand the paradox of that statement, because you're going, now wait a minute. You were born on July 14th, 1975 in the United States, in the state of Michigan, in the county of Oakland, in the city of Pontiac. And here you stand almost 47 years later exactly in the state of Ohio, in the county of Shelby, in the city of Sydney. What do you mean that we don't belong here? And so it becomes even more confusing when you think about this earth and how it's so perfectly tuned for our existence here. Each of us are one of 8 billion people on this tiny blue marble hurtling through space, spinning at 60,000 miles an hour, with a moon positioned perfectly 239,000 miles from us, with a gravitational property that keeps everything on this earth perfectly in place and keeps us from spinning off of our axis. And when you consider that our sun is a perfect 93 million miles away to sustain all the life here, to the point to where if that sun moved 1% either way, this place would be completely uninhabitable. We have an abundant water and food that we need for survival. Even when you look at a real miracle that I look at is photosynthesis. So the notion that we can take sunlight and carbon dioxide into a plant, and the plants feed off oxygen, just that whole cycle is really kind of fascinating in how we have been able to keep us surviving here on this planet. So very, very fascinating when we think about these type of things. But at the same time, why do I still feel like a stranger here? This is our home. Why do we find it so hard to be happy and content? Why are relationships sometimes kind of difficult? Why do we have such unhealthy desires, and why do we have conflict with each other? Why do we feel, amongst 8 billion people, alone sometimes? And why, amidst all the rapid technological evolutions that we are making as a species, do we seem to be devolving morally and spiritually at almost the same pace? I find it kind of interesting that over the last couple of weeks, 1 Peter has come up quite a bit in the messages. I think it's come up 3 times. I'm going to bring it up a fourth. In 1 Peter, chapter 1, verse 1, Peter's writing to a group of believers who have resettled throughout the ancient world, and he writes this: to the pilgrims of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Other translations of the Bible use these terms instead of pilgrims. In the New Living Translation, they use the word foreigners. In the American Standard Version, sojourners. And in the Message, there's that word exile. Right? So Peter continues later in the letter in chapter 5, verse 14, saying that she, meaning the church, is in Babylon. So that term Babylon is going to come up quite a bit, but you can imagine being the reader of this letter being completely confused, right? I'm here in my home. You're sending me this letter. You're saying I'm a stranger. I'm a pilgrim. I'm an exile. And you're saying that the church exists in Babylon, a place that I don't want to be anymore. We were there several hundred years ago. Why do I want to go back to that? But I think what Peter is saying here is that the physical realm in which we live in is not our home. We are exiles in this time and in this place. So we're going on a brief journey back in time to explore this theme of exile a little bit deeper. But to do this, we're going to need a time machine. And I can only think of one time machine that is going to suffice for us. That is an AMC DeLorean, right? So Marty and Doc are ready. The flux capacitor's powered up. We're ready to go. So You guys ready to go? All right. So our first destination is going to be creation. So we're going to go back to the very beginning here. So to think back to what I was mentioning before about how the earth is so finely tuned for our existence here, well, I think it's because that was what was created for us in Eden, right? Which is supposed to be our true home. This is where we belonged. It was a place where we were at peace with one another. We weren't bickering over things that didn't matter. We were in perfect relationship with God. There was plentiful food. We were in community and dominion over the animals. And we were immersed within the beauty that God created on this planet. And I think there are times when we go through life and we experience a lot of this ourselves. And if you've ever been to the zoo and you sit and you watch just the lion roaming around, you get up real close. It's just awe-inspiring. Or the size of an elephant, or studying the mannerisms of a gorilla, or even making eye contact as they're studying you. It's just really interesting and really fascinating. We feel kind of small in that moment. It's the joy we experience in relationships, whether it be with one another or when we're obedient to the Lord. And it's a lot of what we experience, too, that when we're out in nature and we see something beautiful. I know the first time I went to the Grand Canyon, I just stood there and I looked and I'm like, I just can't even describe this to somebody. I mean, I'm looking at these layers of rock, different colors that, were, sediment layered on during the Great Flood. And how did this thing get created? And I want to share a couple pictures to kind of expand about it a little bit. This first one here is a couple weeks back when the tornadoes went through Dayton. They kind of rolled up through Columbus. I was coming back through those, and I stopped on the way home and just saw I've never seen a rainbow end to end before. So I just had to stop and get out and take a picture of it. It was just absolutely beautiful. And the second one here, this was we were in South Dakota a couple of weeks back. I know a lot of people like to use filters on their phones. I don't think God's creation needs a filter. But this was just a really beautiful, unedited sunset from the Great Plains of this country. It was just absolutely breathtaking. But amidst all this beauty, something changed when mankind ate of the fruit of the tree, right? We were separated. We were not content with being solely just with God. We wanted to be God ourselves. So if you got your Bibles today, if you want to open up, there's two places we're going to go today. One is in Genesis 3, and the other one is in Nehemiah chapter 1. But we're going to start in Genesis here this morning in chapter 3, verse 23 and 24. So we eat of the tree. God confronts us, and we go on and eat. This is what he says in starting with 23. Therefore, the Lord God sent him out of the garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. So he drove out the man, and he placed cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden. So not much has really changed in human history, right? In spite of everything that we have today, just about every need we have being met, we have the Spirit within us. We always seem to want more, right? I want this new job, this bigger house. I want more money. I want something else. Not all that different than what we experienced back in the garden. What we had wasn't enough then, and it seems like what we have is not enough now. We'll move on a bit into the story of Cain and Abel. This is the sons of Adam and Eve. And in this story here, we've got the two boys. One's a farmer, Cain. One's a shepherd, Abel. And because they've been sent out to work the ground, that's their vocations now, and they've brought back their first fruits to the Lord, and God accepts Abel's and he rejects Cain's. Cain doesn't like this very much, and so he lures his brother out to the field and he kills him. God confronts him with this, and he uses the famous "Am I my brother's keeper?" Then we move on to, in Genesis 4, chapter 12, this is the judgment that God lays down upon Cain. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth. Cain seems to accept this response, and in verse 14, it says, "Surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on this earth, and it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me." And this concludes in verse 16, with the word saying, "Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden." So there's that word east from Eden again. So interesting little context, the word node, the Hebrew name for that is wandering or land of the wandering. Just an interesting little context to that. So, again, mankind really hasn't changed all that much, not really that different. Ever get jealous of somebody else's success? Maybe not to the point where you take them on the field and slay them, but maybe to the point to where, you might bad talk, somebody to a coworker, or you might, try to sabotage them, or even just having that ill feeling in your heart towards them. Haven't really changed a whole lot. This journey out of Eden comes to an apex in Genesis 11 with the building of the Tower of Babel. So at this point, people are trying to get back in a relationship with God, and they say, hey, let's build a tower. If we can't get him to hear us, maybe we'll reach out to him. And then, of course, God sees this as being a sign of great rebellion. And we see more parallels here to how we are today. Instead of living in obedience to God, we want to become gods ourselves. Because I think really the enemy's playbook really isn't that thick. He's rather predictable. It just is important for us to recognize what his tactics are, and then as believers, having the Word of God by us in our hearts so we know how to combat that. But in Genesis 11:8, we read this. So after confronting the group and disguising their language, so the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth, and they ceased building the city. Ironically, in more context here, this tower was in the land of Shinar, which is present-day Iraq. And Shinar, is the Hebrew name for that, is Babylonia or Babylon. So here we see Babylon again. So throughout these three stories, we see some common terms. Sending and driving out, fugitive to the east, wandering, hidden, scattered abroad. This is all exile-style vocabulary. So key takeaway number 2 is mankind's story is that of a foreigner in exile apart from Eden, forever seeking community with God the Creator once again. The next stop in our journey here is going to be back to 586 BC. So the significance of this time period, this is when Israel is in captivity in Babylon. And the background to that is Abraham is made the father of many nations. He's living in a town called Haran, which is in modern-day Turkey or within kind of the realm of what we call Babylon. From there, he journeys to Canaan, journeys to Egypt, and over time, the Israelites go into captivity, into slavery underneath the Egyptians. God raises Moses, moves them out. Joshua leads them into the promised land. We go through a series of judges, some good, some bad. And then the Israelites say, hey, we need a king. And God provides them with a king. We enter into somewhat of a golden era in Israel's history with King David and King Solomon. But after that, the kingdom fractures. The kingdom splits in the north and the south. And over time, empire after empire, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians move in and start to conquer the area. And in 3 waves, take the Israelites into captivity in Babylon. So at this time, we are introduced to a gentleman named Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah is my favorite book in the entire Bible. I think it has just amazing leadership lessons in it. I've read it so many times. I absolutely love it. So I'm really excited to be able to use him in this example here this morning. But Nehemiah was a Jew, and he was brought in, and he was in the inner circle of the Persian king at that time, so kind of like part of his cabinet. And he had a request of the king. He had heard that Jerusalem was still in flames, well, not flames, but was still in rubble. That the people that had some of the people that had gone back there were struggling a little bit, and he wanted to go back, and he wanted the king's permission to go back to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. So in Nehemiah 1:1, we read this: "For I was the king's cupbearer." So Rabbi asks, well, what is a cupbearer? Okay, glad you asked. So on the next slide, we'll talk about what a cupbearer is. So a cupbearer was a high-ranking official in the king's court, again, kind of like their cabinet. They were responsible, loyal, and trustworthy. Kings at that time were always under threat of assassination. One of the most famous ways of assassinating a king was to poison their food or their drink. So it was up to the cupbearer to guard the king's cup from poisoning. They were also in charge of serving wine at the royal table during big feasts. And this last one is one that I like the most. They were in charge of serving the king, which today kind of makes all of us cupbearers, doesn't it? We're all in charge of serving the King of Kings. So what was Nehemiah actually able to accomplish? Well, the king said, yeah, go back to Jerusalem, rebuild it. He goes back and he wards off some attacks upon his attempt to rebuild the city, rebuilds it, takes many families back. The Torah is read, and we have happily ever after, right? Kinda. Even though they were back in Jerusalem, the Israelites realized they weren't home. They were still under occupation by the Persians, under their government system, under their tax structure. And there's this amazing scene in the book of Ezra, I think it's in chapter 3, verse 12, where the elders, as they're seeing the foundation of the new temple that was rebuilt on the site of Solomon's old temple, they wept. And they wept because they remembered what they had before, and this wasn't the same. And I think that a lot of that's kind of what we feel like today, right, as Americans. We desperately want this country to return back to something that it used to be, something that's maybe got a little bit less chaos in it. I hear a lot of times people say, well, we just need to be a Christian nation again. But what does that really mean? Is that really what we're being called to? Are we called to go back to something that's less perfect than what we have today? Or are we being called to something a little bit better, something a little bit greater? I think that leads us to the third takeaway here is that as followers of Jesus, we are not called to make our way back to Eden or necessarily to a promised land, but instead we are to bring heaven, a new heaven, here to Babylon. This is why, as a church, we go to South Dakota every year. It is why we serve in our communities. It is why we've become committed to becoming a disciple-making church. So, now that we understand who we are, being exiles, and where we are, which is Babylon, what we are to do, which is to usher in a new heaven, what should be our response? So let's go back to the book of Nehemiah. So as we discussed before, Nehemiah requests the king. Well, the context to that is a little bit different. The context to that is that Nehemiah was greatly troubled by what was happening in Jerusalem. He was distracted. So much so that when he was in the presence of the king noticed his sadness. And even asked him, why are you so sad? And he tells him why he was sad. So Nehemiah was stuck. And we go to Nehemiah 1, verse 4. It says this, so it was, when I heard these words, this again of what was going on in Jerusalem, that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. When's the last time you sat down and wept and mourned for something? As I was thinking about this message, I actually had a different message I was going to preach on, but I chose this one, as I said, and I watched the events in Uvalde, Texas unfold back in May of the school shooting, where a shooter took 19 kids and 2 teachers, and just seeing the response of how a lot of that could have been prevented before it even happening, and then even the response of law enforcement at the time. And it troubled me greatly, probably something that hasn't troubled me in a long time, to the point to where I wept, and it was very, very painful. Now, at least the action item number 1, I think, and how we can kind of get unstuck from this chaotic world around us is action step number 1 is identify a cause in this world which you are passionate about. Weep, mourn, fast, and pray over it. If you think back to the number of items that I was showing you, all the chaos that we've got in this world, you can just pick one of those, right, and kind of put your focus towards how can, as a believer, we impact the troubling sex trafficking trade that we've got in this world, or how can we help somebody out that's in a tough spot economically, or somebody that's dealing with mental illness. There's a number of things, both within this body and outside of this community, that we can get involved in, or maybe it's something completely different. But finding that thing that you're really passionate about and going after it. The story goes on in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 2. So after he goes to the king, so this is when he's presenting himself. The king says to him, "Why is your face sad since you were not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart." So I became dreadfully afraid. Why would he become dreadfully afraid? Well, even though he was in the trusted presence of the king, he could have you whacked for just about anything in those days, right? So you had to be always on your toes, always doing your job. But Nehemiah had built such a good relationship with the king that he was able to identify when he was sorrowful and could have him speak freely. I think this moves on to action step number 2 is identify and overcome the fears which are keeping you stuck in this time and place. And we do this a lot. Maybe we've even found something that we're really passionate about and we want to go influence, but maybe I got little kids, or I got this reason, or I've got that reason why I can't go out and serve in this manner. I think overcoming those fears is a very critical step in that process to serving effectively. Then we move on to Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 5. So Nehemiah is making his request. The king says, "What is it that you want?" And he says, "I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." So several years ago, my wife and I, we attended a different church, and when we were there, they had kicked off a 5-year program in Darfur, Sudan, to provide agriculture, sustainable water, and schools for the people. This is a country in Africa, if you're not familiar with the territory. And every year they would do a Christmas miracle offering. I used to love, they used to say, "Christmas is not your birthday, it's Jesus' birthday." I thought that was really, really good. And so every year there would be a collection, and this money would go towards this effort. Then over time, what happened is that you would see this groundswell of people just starting up fundraising activities. And the kids would do a bazaar every year. You have car washes. Well, at this time, one of the women in the church started up an art show. And I was an artist in high school. I hadn't done it in a while. And I thought, what the heck? We'll give that a shot. And so over the course of 3 years, I had sold about $1,100 worth of artwork that was used to go towards this project. So a couple years go by, and one Sunday we're having a report from the gentleman who's kind of the liaison in the Sudan. And he came back and he told us the story, what had been happening there. And he said the first year of this program, they gave the farmers in that area $900 worth of seed to plant. And what they had asked them to do was, after the harvest, is pay back the $900 so they could reinvest that, but then you keep the profits. Well, there's a handful of farmers that hadn't paid back that $900, and so they tracked them down to figure out what was going on. What they found out is that they had taken that money to go buy their children back out of slavery. And so it was just such an amazing moment, another one where I wept very, very deeply, because I went into that not really understanding and not really thinking about what could this talent that I have, how could I use that to serve the kingdom? And here it was used to potentially have a father and a mother buy their kid back out of slavery. It was at that moment that I realized what this faith journey was all about. So instead of reading about Jesus feeding the 5,000, I was feeding the 5,000. And that was the sentimental turning point in my faith walk. So that leads to action step number 3. Go and help build a new heaven in this world. Brothers and sisters, this is our calling. All right, this is what we are supposed to do as believers. To go and to bring God's future promise to this broken and this chaotic world. As the worship team comes back up here this morning, I want to ask you a question. What are those things in your life that is holding you back? Now we know we are exiles, that this is our home, but it's not our home. What can we do to go out and to serve the Lord? Maybe what you're running into is there's a cause that I'm really passionate about, but I'm afraid to step out. I'm afraid to go out and get involved. Maybe this world just got you so paralyzed that you can't seem to think about how you can even get out of this. If you're that person here this morning, there's a place up here for you to come and to pray. Before we wrap up, what I would like to do is I'd like to read Nehemiah's prayer. as he had taken in the words of what was going on in Jerusalem, and before he approached the king, this was his prayer and how he wanted to change things. It's found in Nehemiah 1, verses 5 through 11. If you'd like to read along, you can. If you'd like to sit quietly prayer, you're more than welcome to do that too. Or if you want to come up to the altar, that's perfectly fine as well. But it says this, Nehemiah, "And I said, I pray, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments, please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now. Day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned, and we have not kept the commandments, the statutes, nor the ordinances which you have commanded your servant Moses. Remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out to the farthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I have chosen as a dwelling place for my name. Now these are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name. And let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. For I was the king's cupbearer."